That's the Gall Midge. How many of you had issues with soybean gall midge this year? Okay, a couple of you. I have petitions. We had a roundtable discussion. I know Midwest was at that, and I'll cover that a little bit. But these petitions are not to catch you or anything. They're actually to help us get federal funding and other funding resources, competitive grants, to address this issue. We just learned about it in June, right? So we're trying to play catch up essentially. And so I'll pass these around. Feel free to sign it if you want to support that. The top kind of describes why we have that. The other one is Dectes stem borer. Bill asked me to cover that a little bit. This one is not new to the U.S. It's been here. It's native insect. It's transitioned to soybeans is what is new for some of us, but and it's steadily moving northward. So a couple collaborators on this. Tom Hunt and Bob Wright, who many of you probably know, those guys have been helping with a lot of these issues. And if you've really got heavy questions on Dectes stem borer, I recommend Bob Wright, Dr. Bob Wright. Bob's worked on this with a graduate student. I'll show a little bit of his data. So soybean gall midge is not new to us. It is a new species. It was only recently described here this fall. And the adults were only observed in August, but what we used to call orange gall midge has been around since 2011. At least we assume it's the same species. Up in the Northeast, Tom described it, a few isolated fields. It was really what we considered, and even when we started this season, it was a secondary pest of either mechanical damage or some disease that was already in the plant. And we assumed that it had come in secondary to those problems, and so it wasn't something we were placing a lot of research on, because we thought, well, manage the other things and we don't have a problem with this midge. And it always showed up late in the season. I started my position in 2016, and every year, mid to late August, get a phone call actually from Erin Hodgson, extension educator, and go out and look at the same two fields that seemed to have this midge. But it was so late in the season that we kind of just set it aside and thought, well, it's too late to really have an economic impact. It's really hard to get dollars, research dollars, when something is that late. Now, we all know what happened in 2018. None of this information is surprising, but it showed up 2 months earlier than what we would have expected. So instead of Erin calling in August, he called in late June, and we were seeing a large number of fields through multiple states. A number of entomologists got involved, and we have received some grants to work on this spring, which is critical to your decision-making process, because I know a lot of you are thinking, if you've had issues, what do I do in 2019? And so we're trying to avoid just putting on an insecticide. I've already heard those stories from others that tried in for activity of adults. And since we've recently identified the adults and we know how to track them, we can use that as a way of getting the most efficacy out of those potential treatments. Many of you are familiar with the third instar of this insect. That's the orange that you see there. In fact, there's a little tiny insect on top of it just to show you how small they get. But the second and first instars, as it moves through development stages, they're white. And so if you're scouting early this year or breaking off plants trying to find them, you may find them as little white maggots on the plant rather than orange. And typically we find them right at the soil line. This is a soybean plant turned upside down. It was not difficult to snap. Tamara mentioned they're difficult to pull out of the ground, but to break them off, they break off quite easy. And like Dectes stem borer, that was the primary concern as we were going into the fall, was how many of these plants would lodge, the ones that were still alive. And this is, again, if you do that, peel back tissue on the plant, and you'll find, if they're there in these darkened areas of the plant. So as I mentioned earlier, first report was on June 29th. I'm not going to hold to this date. I'm going to try and backtrack as much as I can for you to when we think they first got into these fields. That's the insight coming into this next year for management. I was out there. We were looking at healthy, wilted, and dead plants. They ranged quite a bit. Most of them were at the field edge. This is typically what we were seeing, 2 or 3 in the afternoon. The plants would start kind of flagging or wilting. Essentially, they were losing their turgor pressure. They couldn't stand up anymore. Some would recover. We were out in this field a couple days in a row. Some would recover, and then eventually they'd just die off. We were already finding the third instar larvae at that stage, and this is that darkened area at the bottom of the plant. This is really common. I drove a lot of eastern Nebraska looking at fields. It was very common, but as I got up north, and especially as we got into Varenhorst territory in South Dakota, he was seeing this blackening, but he was also seeing an expansion of the stems, a galling, so an increase in the size and diameter. And so this may change probably depending on the variety and other influences, but typically right at that soil line. The other thing was the maturity group. So we was looking at a lot of 2s and 3s. As we pulled up into the upper part of the 3s, we saw it higher up on the plant, and I'm not sure if that's the second generation that might come out, might attack higher, or the physiology of those plants. But they were up in the axils here, and there was darkened areas around the axils. So don't look right at the soil line. Be looking up those plants as well, especially as we go through the season. 100% of the plants were infested in this field, 3 to 16 larvae per plant. As we moved into the field, we had about 20% infested, and there were larvae present, at least at this time in that particular field. This is later. This is August time frame when we were out there. You could see that the progression and the visible symptoms from the row. We had dead plants in quite a distance into the field. That discoloration of the base was still easily present. The plants were obviously snapping off. And then as Adam saw some of these swollen stems. I have this array of photos here to kind of show you the variation in symptoms as you walk through a field. This is the one from an entomologist standpoint. I'm also an agronomist by training. That's most interesting to me because it tells me when infestation occurred early in the season. If I've got a stone dead V3 to V5 stage plant, I know infestation occurred prior to that. And so dialing back that time frame to when things occurred. But the array here, I'll dig into this a lot more detail. Was around, if we were seeing multiple generations, if we were seeing impacts on yield components, how could we flesh that out a little bit better to understand what might be going on? So we initiated a multi-state survey across several states. Myself, Tom Hunt, and Bob Wright focused in on Nebraska here. I'm going to show you a detailed survey of Nebraska. We're going to piece apart. I'm not as good as Tyler with maps, so I'm going to kind of show you some of the maps, but Tyler did a great job of highlighting happen in this state and the exceptions I think that this year was. So it's my hope, even though I like federal funding, that this was an unusual year and that 2019 is a dial back on pressure with soybean gall midge. That's my hope, but we're ready to challenge this. So Erin Hodgson's Iowa State's done a lot. She just put out a fact sheet on soybean gall midge. Adam Varenhorst, South Dakota, and Bruce Potter, we're all involved on a larger multi-state grant right now that we got as emergency funding. 65 counties, 4 states. Everybody says, why 2018, right? We've got, if you talk to people, we've heard these isolated pockets for a number of years. Since 2014 is the common year I hear. But why did it explode? And I think, Tyler might have highlighted, you get large expansion like this over the states, usually some environmental condition is sitting there that ramped up some of the risk and pressure. So we'll hope that's a larger factor and that doesn't happen next year. The other thing I want to highlight is out here. If you were looking at this map, you were going, why is there counties way out in Minnesota to the north and east that are not kind of contiguous with the rest of the counties? We think this is a different species altogether, not one of economic importance to soybeans. It was higher up, it was actually in the pods, and it was feeding on fungi associated with white mold. So we're still trying to sort that one out. I overwhelmed the taxonomist here in the US submitting samples trying to get a handle on this one. So he's going to look at that one later. But this one extends up into Canada and into Ontario. So plant pathogens, Tamara did a great job kind of summarizing the season and looking through things. And so, we focused in. I talked with Kyle Broderick in the plant pathology diagnostic clinic to say, hey, you were getting these samples throughout the season. Kyle, like me, was not thinking this is a major issue in June when he was getting a lot of these samples. And so he wasn't trying to piece them out. And so I asked him kind of, what was your perception of the amount of those samples that came in with disease? And he said probably 15 to 20% came in with no disease presence. Now, this is where if you're a plant pathologist, you say, well, 80% of them had disease, right? So there must be some association. So it's all about how you look at it. We just submitted a grant to the Nebraska Soybean Board to focus on the disease interaction side of this. So if a disease is present or absent, or we completely manage as much of the fungal pathogens as we can, what is the relationship with soybean gall midge? So is there a preference for diseased plants? Are they targeting areas that have, or are under pressure? Is the infestation potential influenced by whether or not the plant is compromised by something else? And then most importantly to your pocketbook and how you manage this is what are the yield losses if both are present or one or the other is present? So these are some of the questions we're trying to answer this coming season. So let's dig in this survey. The survey is helpful for a couple reasons. It kind of helps you understand what's happening in the state and what we saw. But then also I think it might help you with scouting. This is reproductive stage soybean scouting, so it'll be different for what we see in the spring. And You know, if you follow Bob or I on Twitter, we're going to be posting a lot about what we see as we watch during the season to show you what we might be looking for. But essentially we took set distances in the field 10, 20, 50, 100, and 400 feet. Basically what I did was I leaned down with my forearm about 1.5 to 2 feet off the ground, bent the plants over, and they would snap all near the soil surface. And that was an easy way to initially look at those plants and say, is there any infestation occurring? And so it's a kind of a quick and dirty method. You know, here's a blowing up of a soybean gall midge here, the maggots right near the soil surface. And so these blackened areas, I typically peel those back and look and see if there's any larvae there. But essentially the map you're about to see is the percentage of those infected. If I'm 400 feet out in the field and I'm achieving 80 to 100% infestation, we have a significant problem in that field, right? And the dial backs down to 1 to 19% is really just presence. I could find it, but I wasn't seeing any field symptoms as far as driving by and knowing there was a given issue. So here's Nebraska. There are a number of red dots here and large spaces in between. I'm obviously located at the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center, so I spent a lot of time around there. But I plunked a green dot here because we do have fields where you drive by and there are no pressure issues, and then literally a mile down the road a field's getting annihilated by this particular insect. And I think that in part probably relates to the cropping history, the rotation, what is in the adjacent field. There are a lot of factors, landscape level factors, that can be popped on top of this particular situation that will become more clear. But you can see things kind of dial back as we got down into the southeastern part of the state here. I initially got these reports and headed south, and I thought, well, maybe this really isn't much of an issue in the state. And then we got some presence down here, but that was a drier area. So I'm going to spend the next couple slides, and of course we have one out here, so that we're going to initiate surveys going west in Nebraska here this coming spring to get a better handle on this summer. So Tyler did a great job on the temperatures. I'm going to basically just pop them up really quick to save on time. 8 to 10 below Fahrenheit, for the 30-year normal in April. Not a lot of overlaps with the areas specifically highlighting. May we got warm again. June warm again, so kind of under and then catching back up in May and June. The big thing I want to focus in on is the precipitation. We got a lot of precipitation. I was up in Minnesota giving a talk on this particular issue and was showing this Nebraska map, where we do have large amounts of precipitation in the northeast, extended all the way down to the corner. Maybe there's something here. When we collected adults in August, I ran back to the greenhouse with them and started initiating greenhouse trials with the adults. And the success we had in the greenhouse was under wet conditions with adult infestation. They were willing to attack a healthy plant, even when given a choice between healthy and damaged plants, which definitely raises the level of concerns, but it was done under very wet conditions. So, if we had more time with the adults before they stopped emerging, maybe we could have learned something as far as the